I do have a winner that will lead us into the Suns.
Okay.
My winner is the Minnesota Timberwolves, just in sum. I think, look, to me, proof of concept was not a burden they ever should have needed to ferry entering the playoffs. They just won 56 games. They had the league's best defense and spent the majority of the year atop the Western Conference. Now, they didn't finish atop the Western Conference, and this core, fully healthy, is new to the playoffs. So there's still that level of curiosity, but to look at them when they just had the league's best defense by basically a mile and have this doubt and look at Phoenix and say, they're built to stress test their defense because of their shot makers, because of the shots that they want to take, the Timberwolves are going to give them. And you were the one that pointed this out to me. And the piece is not live, so I hope that you were correct. But like the Suns entered that series as favorites, correct? The odds-on favorites. And it's, well, the Timberwolves offense can gum up, and look at the turnover issues, and Karl-Anthony Towns is coming back from a meniscus injury. We just saw 82 games of the Suns like showing us who they were, which is talented at the top, shallow everywhere else, the league's preeminent explorers of both extreme peaks and desolate valleys. But we decided the Timberwolves, who just had more of an higher end equilibrium, even when things weren't going to go, even when Karl-Anthony Towns went injured and they were still pulling out victories. It might have been imperfect. It was happening. Now you're up 2-0 on the team that was just almost universally considered the less than ideal matchup for you. And I'm not saying people didn't not have a point about, well, Phoenix might be able to do this, but this like lingering doubt that the Timberwolves were anything but a legitimate threat to come out of the Western Conference. But like, weren't they just the team that the Nuggets said? I'm not even ascribing my own thoughts here, that the Nuggets said were the toughest out they had in the West last year. And so now to come in, and you know what? Karl-Anthony Towns has been chaotic at points. Like, he's done the thing where he throws the passes and you have no idea where it's going to go. Questionable decisions. You have Naz Reid. You've seen him cool off on the offensive end. Guess what? You have Nickeil Alexander-Walker. You have, after I'm yelling about Jaden McDaniels, and then he goes and hits every single two-pointer known to man, creating off the dribble. Shout out to, we had a few Timberwolves fans. I think they commented, someone added me on Twitter, someone DM'd me, thanking me for going on a Jaden McDaniels rant because he clearly heard it. And the podcast was recorded like before he had that game, so I don't think he heard it. But I love when fan bases are that self-aware, is all I'm saying. So that was really super cool. But you have Anthony Edwards, who is just this, like, he is on the court. He is just someone who can go toe to toe at both ends with Kevin Durant and Devin Booker and emerge as the one that looks better off for it. You have Rudy Gobert, who still moving as well as I've ever seen him, but Rudy wasn't a liability ever in the playoffs so much as he just had no perimeter defensive talent around him. Now you give him a bunch of perimeter defensive talent around him, and look at what's happening. And so the Wolves are huge winners here. And I'll also say this is why too, not just because, like, in theory, the third place team shouldn't gain anything from beating the sixth place team, just emotionally or any equity there. But here's what's going on in the background: the battle for control of the franchise, and then this financial sustainability of the core that is going to be an issue depending on how that plays out, or an issue regardless. People want to continue talking about that. And here are the Wolves. And by the way, we've talked about the super tax concerns with them, so I'm not excluding us from maybe being part of the problem. We haven't focused on it, I don't think, as much as others. So that stuff is happening, and you're just coming out and taking like that's legitimate distraction to me. If you're like, if we had a producer who was talking about maybe like, oh, can we afford both Dan and Grant? And with your salary demands, when you poo-pooed that $80 million contract,
probably not. Probably not.
So I'd have an existential crisis if, like, we're still tasked with doing the job, but that it could be. I get that it's happening at a scale where it's not as mission critical as someone's necessarily livelihood, but they're just taking care of business here. And I think they're massive winners through it all. And also not a side winner, but like Tim Connolly having the option of getting out of his deal with, like, he's a huge winner now because look what he did with this roster. And he has like phantom equity in the team. That was the other report that came out. So he might not actually have like a ton of equity. So he might be more willing to leave, which gives him leverage if they want to keep him around. So I think the Timberwolves, though, immediately just looking at this postseason trip, are huge winners.
I think that's right. I would say too, like, what's happened in these first two games and the way the Wolves have looked and the way that like none of what we sort of priced into a Suns potential upset has happened really makes me now look, it's so easy in any series, like when the first couple games go a certain way, to just be like, every prior I had is clearly wrong and like none of that was going to hold up. But like for this series in particular, I think you're right that it's just like it got overthought, and not just by us but by like everybody. Because well, did you pick the Suns? I think I picked the Suns.
No, you picked the Suns. I picked the Timberwolves,
Okay,
and I think
well
I had
then
them
you're
in
fine.
6.
You're fine then. But
No,
like,
because they're probably going to win in 4.
you're in better shape than I am. But for me and for everybody else and the odds makers that made the Suns favorites, it's just like, maybe just trust the bigger sample. Maybe just don't overthink the matchups and all this other stuff. Now next year probably we'll have a situation where the reverse will be true, and we didn't think hard enough about the matchups and how this team is good at X and the other team is bad at Y, and that means they can't, like it'll flip. But for now, it just feels like we overthought. Like, why are we taking a lower seed over a Wolves team that was just better all year and just didn't have the lows? Like, so I want to talk about the Suns a little bit more. I know we're kind of picking on them, but like, let me start with a question. The Suns and Matt Ishbia is specifically the Suns owner is going to come out of this, I think, looking like one of our postseason losers. When you think about like the example of, man, do you remember when they put this team together, like how bad it seemed at the time and how catastrophic the downstream effects were going to be? Like, what do you have a go-to example? I can give you mine that I like, and that a lot of people kind of like pull to mind when trying to talk about like what a catastrophe that whole like team building era was. Like I go like the Brooklyn Nets when they traded for Garnett and Pierce and Darren Williams and like gave up their draft future for a bunch of old guys that like, and it just set the team back for years and years until they just landed superstars. You know what I mean? Like, do you have another example of that comes to mind?
No, I mean, like there's smaller scale stuff. Like I still want a book to be published on the Carmelo Anthony trade negotiations in 2011, where the Knicks just kept throwing stuff at the Nuggets, even though Melo didn't want to go anywhere other than them. But like, no, I don't think on. I'm trying to. I mean, because even the Nets, when they got the way that ended with Kyrie, Durant, and Harden, that was different because one, they were able to recoup value on 2 of those guys on the way out, and also they didn't have to give up a ton to get Kyrie and Kevin Durant in the first. Like it was cap space, and they were able to keep like Karis LeVert and Jared Allen were still on that team when they signed those guys.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think
you're gonna have one soon because you're gonna reference the Suns that we're currently watching as that team. This is not new information. You know this. Everybody else knows this. To put this roster together, they grossly overpaid for Kevin Durant, gave up all these picks, Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, this, that, and the other. They are the only team willing to take on Bradley Beal, so they give up all the rest of their swaps, and they take on this contract that still I think is among the worst in the league just because of the no trade and because of the money left and because of the type of player that Beal is at this stage of his career. They don't control a draft pick till 2031. They are in the super tax. They don't have the ability. They're going to be heavily restricted by like all of the new teeth that come in with second apron teams in terms of like who you can and can't trade, whether you can aggregate salaries, like all these things are going to further hinder them building rosters. That's part of the reason I think Grayson Allen got that extension is it's like, well, we don't have resources to do anything else, so we got to just keep this guy. And maybe they do that with some other players with extensions, but like there aren't any outs here. Things look really bad 2 games into this series. If you're saying it'll be fine next year when Kevin Durant is a year older and Bradley Beal is a year older, and you don't have the means to bring in the type of supplementary talent you need to avoid what's happening here. And even if you do, it's also possible that these 3 players just don't make sense together in the biggest games. So like this all happened. Dan, they were in the finals in 2021. They won 62, 64 games in 22. And then Ishbia kind of takes official control at the 23 trade deadline. And now here's where we are. Like Devin Booker's like the only guy left from those good teams. Maybe you had to break them up. Maybe nobody was listening to Monty Williams anymore. Maybe you don't want to hang on to Chris Paul. Maybe DeAndre Ayton is not someone you build around. But to go from that to this, and then looking at the next 7-8 years and like seeing no light at the end of the tunnel other than we trade Devin Booker and get a bunch of picks back at some point, like I think this is gonna be one of the most like most cited examples of like how an ownership group comes in and like can just wreck a team with short-sighted moves and like trying to make splashes and not thinking about like, well, how do other smart teams operate? Should we do that? No. We're going to do this. And here's where we are. Like, I think the Suns are going to be that example going forward.